Somewhere on the stones in front of Notre-Dame in Paris, set into the pavement of the square, there is a small bronze star, no wider than a dinner plate. Around its rim, in plain letters, are the words Point Zero des Routes de France, every road sign in France that tells you the distance to Paris, every Paris, 412 kilometers, is counting very quietly from that star. Tourists walk over it without noticing. The whole map of the country bends gently toward this spot. This is a quiet place to fall asleep and to wake up knowing one small thing you didn't know before. So settle in, let your shoulders soften, and the day go quiet for a while. Slow the breath and let your eyes rest on whatever is closest to dark. There is nothing here that needs to be hurried, nothing more to hold. Tonight we will drift through 850 years of one stone building on a small island in the Seine, a cathedral, a forest hidden above its ceiling, a great bell, a blue that nobody can quite make any more. One slow night, gathered from many centuries. There is no hurry. Tonight we begin at the very top of the cathedral, in a place that almost no visitor ever sees. If you had climbed Notre Dame any quiet night in the last 700 years, and if you had brought a small lantern, and if you had pushed open the right small door at the top of one of the towers, you would have stepped into something almost no one ever saw. Above the stone ceiling, and below the lead skin of the roof, there was a forest, not a forest in any soft leafy sense, a forest of beams, a forest of old dry oak, dark with the dust of centuries, laid across the long axis of the cathedral in the shape of an upside-down ship. The carpenters who built it gave it a name, and the name stayed for 800 years. They called it La Forêt, the forest. It was made from roughly 1,300 oak trees, one full-grown tree for each major beam. 1,300 lives in the forests of medieval France, felled with iron axes, dragged by oxen, floated down quiet rivers, hauled up wooden scaffolding, and pinned together with wooden pegs by people whose names were never written down. For 7.5 centuries, anyone walking the nave below, anyone praying, anyone passing through, anyone tilting their head back to look at the painted vault, was standing under a forest and never knew it. Picture for a moment the trees themselves. The trees that became the forest above Notre Dame were felled around the year 1160, 1170 at the latest. Felled when the cathedral below them was barely a ground plan, before there were walls, before there were windows, before there was anything visitors today would recognize. Somewhere in the great oak forests of the Ile-de-France, axemen were already cutting trees for a roof that no one alive would live to see finished. Each tree was around 150 years old when it was cut, which means that the wood inside the medieval roof of Notre Dame had begun growing very slowly in the year 1010 or thereabouts. A few of those oaks were saplings before the Norman conquest of England. They had spent half a millennium turning sunlight into wood, very quietly, on the soft soil of medieval France, before they were ever measured by a man with a rope. The wood was older than the building, The wood was older than almost anything we still remember from that century, and when the carpenters laid it across the rising stone walls, they laid it down beam against beam and let it rest there in darkness for the next 800 years. The medieval carpenters did not hurry the trees. There is a story, half folklore and half record, that says the oaks were stripped of their bark, weighted with stones, and lowered into a swamp. There they were left, submerged for decades. The slow water of the swamp protected the wood from insects and fungi. The trunks darkened, but they did not rot. When the wood was finally lifted from the water, possibly around 1225, around 60 years after the first axe strokes, it was hauled to a yard near the cathedral and sawn into beams. The beams were then stacked and left in the air to season for another long while before they were ever pinned in place. You can read that as a story about technology, but you can also read it as a story about patience. The carpenters who began the work knew they would not finish it. The trees they cut would not be roof beams during their lifetime, and the roof those beams supported would not be a finished cathedral during their children's lifetime either. The work was made for grandchildren of grandchildren. The pace of the building was the pace of trees. Picture the smell of that wood, lifted at last out of the swamp, cold, heavy, slightly green, slightly mineral. Picture the men carrying it on their shoulders to the saw pits. Picture the saw pits, a long, deep trench with one man standing in it and one above, working a great vertical saw between them. The dust falling on the lower man's face, the yellow oak being cut slowly into the long, square beams that would later be raised hand over hand to the top of the cathedral. Once the beams reached the top, they were assembled into trusses. Each truss was a triangle of wood pinned at every joint by smaller wooden pegs called tree nails. There were no iron nails of any size at first. The medieval roof was a forest joined to itself by little wooden pieces of the same tree it had come from. The trusses repeated, one after another, down the entire length of the cathedral. From above, looking down, the framework would have looked like the ribs of a great whale, upside down, hollow, breathing slow air. Now imagine sound up there in that hidden forest. The wood, year after year, expanding and contracting with weather. A small creak in summer, a long, slow groan in winter, the patter of a pigeon's feet on the ridge above, sometimes a swallow threading its way through a crack between two beams, finding the soft dark inside, building a nest. Sometimes nothing, for hours, days, whole seasons, nothing, except the wood quietly settling on itself, as wood does when no one is listening. The forest above the cathedral lived through everything that happened below it. It lived through the long, slow finishing of the cathedral itself, well into the middle of the 13th century. It lived through the 100 Years' War, when Paris changed hands, and the streets below the towers were sometimes English, sometimes French. It lived through the wars of religion, when the city around it was unsteady, and through the cold winters of the Little Ice Age, when ice sometimes coated the lead above the beams. It lived through the Revolution, when below it the bells were broken and the statues thrown into the square. It lived through Napoleon, through the Commune, through 2 world wars, through the long, quiet decades of the 20th century. In all of those centuries, the forest above the ceiling did not change very much at all. A few beams were replaced in places over the years. A few were patched. A few were strengthened. But the framework as a whole, almost intact, almost untouched, kept doing the same quiet job. It held up the roof. It cast a slow shadow on itself. It smelled always faintly of old oak. And then, in a single evening in April of 2019, the forest was gone. We will not stay long with that evening tonight. We will return to it more gently in a later chapter. For now, it is enough to say that the medieval forest above Notre-Dame had stood in roughly the same shape for more than 7 centuries, and in less than 3 hours it became ash. What grew slowly burned quickly. That is, in one sentence, the relationship of fire to old wood. The story does not end there. After the ashes had cooled, and after the scaffolding had been raised, and after the survey teams had walked carefully along the broken stone of the vaults, a quiet and very large question waited. Could the forest be rebuilt? Could a country still find, in the early 21st century, 1,300 oaks of the right size to replace the ones that had stood there since the Middle Ages? The honest answer was, barely. Modern French forests, managed for furniture and small construction, generally cut their oaks at around 100 years old. The medieval oaks above Notre-Dame had stood for half again as long. To match them, foresters across France searched through state forests and private estates, marking individual trees by hand. About 1,000 oaks came from public forests, 300 or so from private ones. Each was measured, each had its lineage recorded, each was felled in the autumn when the sap was low, exactly as a medieval woodcutter would have done it. The trees were then squared with axes by hand, not with modern sawmills, to mimic the surface marks the original beams had carried. A new forest made of new old oaks was prepared, slowly, patiently, almost on the medieval pace. It is a small thing to know, but it is something to carry with you. Above the stone vault of Notre-Dame tonight, there is a forest again. The wood is bright, still, where the old wood was dark. It smells of fresh sap, where the old wood smelled of long settled dust. And in 9 centuries perhaps, when no one alive remembers any of us, it will be dark and dry, and someone with a lantern will push open a small door at the top of a tower, and the smell of old oak will meet them. And up there, all year long, the small interior weather of the forest went on without anyone watching. In summer, the lead above the beams grew warm in the afternoon sun. The wood, sensing the warmth, would expand the smallest amount, beam against beam, peg against peg. A soft creak, somewhere along the ridge, a pause, another creak, the whole framework breathing very slowly, in the dark, the way a sleeping animal breathes. In winter, the lead grew cold, the wood drew in on itself. The creaks were longer, slower, deeper. Sometimes ice formed in the cracks between the lead plates, and water dripped in small steady drops onto a beam below. the beam would darken in a small patch. Years later, a worker doing a small repair would notice the darker patch and shake his head and move on. During the long candle-lit ceremonies down in the nave, the Easter vigils, the funerals, the great feast days, the smoke of the candles rose almost invisibly up through the small joints in the stone vault and reached the forest. The smoke left a slow, faint coating on the underside of the beams. Centuries of candle smoke layered, centuries of incense. The wood of the forest was, in a sense, made of trees and slow Parisian smoke. The men who tended it over the years were never many. A small handful of carpenters in any given century were trusted to climb the towers and walk the small wooden gangways laid across the trusses. They carried small lanterns, the same way medieval workmen had, because the lead roof above made any high window impossible. They moved carefully. The light bobbed and steadied. They knocked with small wooden mallets against beams to test their soundness, listening for the deep, full note that meant the wood was still solid, or the soft, hollow note that meant a beam might be rotting somewhere inside. Most of the time, the note was the deep, full one. The forest, for centuries, was simply sound. The carpenters would come back down, write a brief report, and the forest would be left alone again for years. Somewhere in the small museum displays in Paris today, there are pieces of the old forest that have survived, charred fragments set carefully in glass cases, small blackened beam ends, a tree nail the size of a finger, still recognizable as a wooden peg. If you stand close to the glass, you can sometimes catch a faint smell. Burnt oak, very old, very slow. The forest, in pieces, still has a voice. Far below the forest, the stone walls of the cathedral hold the same shape they have held for 800 years. And on those walls, at the corners and edges where the rain runs off and where the towers meet the sky, small stone creatures lean out, watching the city. They look as if they have always been there, but they have not. They are younger than they appear, and their story is the next quiet thing we will follow. At the corners and edges of Notre-Dame, leaning out over the rooftops of Paris, there are stone creatures. You have probably seen them. They are some of the most photographed pieces of stone in the world. A goat-headed figure with a heavy chin, a long serpentine creature with wings folded against its back, a pelican-like bird with a mournful eye, and, most famous of all, a brooding, almost human creature with its elbow resting on a stone railing, its chin cupped in its hand, gazing out over the city as if it has watched everything Paris has ever done. That one has a name. He is called Lestrige, the vampire. He is in nearly every guidebook, in nearly every photograph, in nearly every postcard, the face of medieval Notre-Dame. Here is the small, quiet thing that almost no one says out loud. He is not medieval at all. Lestrige is younger than the camera that first photographed him. He was carved in the 1850s. He is about 170 years old, give or take a decade, when the trees that became the forest above the cathedral were already 600 years dry. Lestrige was still in a stonecutter's mind, waiting to be made. He is not alone. The famous chimeras of Notre-Dame, almost all of them, looking out from the high gallery between the two towers, were designed during the great restoration of the cathedral carried out between 1843 and 1864. The two architects in charge were Jean-Baptiste Lassus and Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, and most of the carving was done by a sculptor named Victor Piani. Piani's name today is almost unknown, but more of his stone is photographed every day by more visitors than perhaps any sculptor of his century. The chimeras have, as one architectural historian put it plainly, no archaeological base. That is to say, there is no medieval drawing of them, no medieval description of them, no remnant of an older version of them set aside in a museum. They were not in any sense restorations of something that had been there before. They were made in the middle of the 19th century by a generation of architects who wanted Notre Dame to look more medieval than the actual Middle Ages had left it. It is worth slowing down on that, because it is gently strange. By the 1840s, when the restoration began, Notre Dame had been standing for nearly 700 years. It had been worked on, patched, rebuilt in places, and damaged in others. The revolution had taken its toll. In 1793, a crowd had pulled down the statues of the kings of Judah from the cathedral's facade, believing them to be the kings of France. The bells had been melted down. The lead had been stripped from some of the roofs. By the time Viollet-le-Duc and Lassus arrived, the cathedral was tired in the way that very old buildings become tired. Still standing, still beautiful, but a little softer at the edges than it once had been. And so the architects did something that, in any honest sense, was an act of imagination as much as an act of repair. They added what they thought a great Gothic cathedral ought to have, a new spire, taller and more dramatic than the medieval one, a new family of chimeras, each one a little stranger than the last, perched in the high gallery to make the cathedral feel older, darker, and more haunted than it actually was. This is why, when people today think of medieval gargoyles, they often have a 19th century image in their head. The dark, brooding, almost human creatures of fantasy films and Victorian engravings, those came largely from this restoration. The Middle Ages, by comparison, were less theatrical. Their stone monsters were usually more functional, smaller, often half hidden in corners. The drama of the chimeras is a romantic invention. Now imagine the workshop in which they were made. A small wooden shed somewhere near the cathedral. The smell of stone dust and lamp oil. Pianet, in a leather apron, chisel in one hand, sketch in the other. The sketches themselves had been worked out by Viollet-le-Duc, careful drawings of creatures with goat heads, fish bodies, wings of leather. The architect would hand over a sketch. The sculptor would translate it into stone. The block of limestone would slowly become a body, a face, an elbow, a long stone fingernail. Each creature is unique. There are dozens of them up there, even now. Some have wings, some have ears like donkeys, some have small grinning mouths and human-looking shoulders. They were not arranged at random. Viollet-le-Duc placed them strategically so that each silhouette, seen against the Parisian sky, would feel inevitable. They were a piece of stage design, in the best sense of that phrase, a set built for a Gothic story that the 19th century wanted to keep telling. Long before these stone creatures, there were of course true gargoyles, and here we should pause on the word itself. Gargoyle, in the strict architectural sense, comes from the French gargouille, a rainwater spout, an architectural drain. The Old French and the Latin behind it share a root with the word gargle. The sound a gargoyle makes is the sound of water passing through a stone throat. The next time you say the word gargle, you are saying a 13th century stonemason's word, very lightly disguised. The original medieval gargoyles of Notre-Dame were drains, where the lead gutters along the upper walls and parapets needed to discharge their water. The medieval stonecutters carved long, narrow creatures, dogs, dragons, fantastic animals, whose mouths held the spouts of the gutters. When it rained, the water poured out through their mouths, away from the wall, so that the stone below did not stain or rot. Some of those original gargoyles survived into the modern era. Many were eroded, broken, or replaced over the centuries. Many of the spouts on the cathedral today are 19th century replacements modeled on what remained. But the distinction between a gargoyle and a chimera in the cathedral is precise. A gargoyle has a hole in its mouth and a pipe in its body. A chimera is decoration. A gargoyle works. A chimera watches. Most of the photographs you have seen of Notre Dame's gargoyles are, in fact, photographs of its chimeras. The famous ones, l'ostrich, the long-necked bird, the goat, do not carry rain. They are not connected to anything. They are simply leaning on a railing, looking at Paris. It is worth carrying that with you. The next time someone speaks of the medieval monsters of Notre Dame, you can think gently that the most famous of them are not medieval, and the most medieval of them are not monsters but drains. There is another small thing about the chimeras that may be worth saying. They are slowly weathering. The limestone of which they were carved, soft, porous, pale, has been standing in the rain of Paris for 170 years now. The carvings are still recognizable, but they are softer around the edges than they were when Pianet last set down his chisel. Lestrigue's elbow is rounder, his brow is less sharp. In another 100 years, perhaps 200, his face will be unreadable. The brood will dissolve slowly back into rough stone. Like everything else on the cathedral, the chimeras are temporary on the long view. They will be replaced eventually. The cathedral will keep watching. The watches will change. Now imagine the city below them. Paris in the 1850s, when they were new, must have looked entirely different from the Paris of today. Horses in the streets below, gas lamps in the squares, smoke rising from 1,000 small chimneys. The Eiffel Tower would not exist for another generation. The Seine still carried small boats with lanterns at night. The chimeras looked out from a higher gallery onto a city that, from above, was lower and softer and slower. They were the same chimeras then as now. Paris was a different city, and below the chimeras, below the gallery, below the carved facade, The cathedral itself rose from the small island, tall walls, a great central window, a pair of bell towers, the whole of it lifted out of the dense low rooftops of medieval and early modern Paris, like a single tall ship moored in a small harbor. There are dozens of chimeras up there when you count them all. Most visitors only see L'Estridge and the bird. Few people climb high enough to see the others. Those who do climb, who pay the small ticket to walk the upper gallery in the season when it is open, find a kind of small open-air sculpture park set into the stone of the cathedral. There is a chimera with the body of a small dragon, scales etched along its back, looking down toward the river. There is one with a goat's head and a slightly human shoulder, leaning on a railing as if waiting for someone. There is a small elephant, entirely unexpected, almost smiling, perched on a corner above the south tower. There is a creature whose head looks like a bird, but whose body looks like a bear, and whose tail trails down behind it in long stone loops. Each one is unique. Each one has its own small story, made up at a desk in 1850 by a man with a pencil. The gallery they stand in is called the Galerie des Chimères. It is a narrow stone walkway between the two towers, with a low parapet on the outside. The chimeras lean out from that parapet at intervals. The view from the gallery, on a clear evening, is one of the great views of Paris, the river running both ways past the island, the spires of other churches rising in the distance, the long line of the Louvre to the west, the small green of the city's parks to the south. The chimeras were placed there for that view. Viollet-le-Duc understood that they would be seen in photographs against the Parisian sky. He arranged them so that no chimera would be hidden behind another. Each had its own slot. Each had its own pose. The whole gallery was, in a careful way, a stage for slow stone actors who would never move. Now imagine them at night, when the gallery is closed, the tourists are gone, the small gate at the top of the spiral stair is locked, the chimeras are alone with the wind. The wind around the towers of Notre-Dame is almost always there, never strong enough to be a storm, but never quite silent either. It moves around the chimeras with a small whistle, finds the gaps in their carved bodies, the hollows behind their ears, the small concave shapes under their wings. Each chimera in the wind makes its own faint sound, a thin breathy note, slightly different from the chimera beside it. A trained ear, listening from the gallery, might pick out a soft chord of breathy notes drifting from the row of stone bodies. The chimeras, in their way, sing. They have been singing very quietly for 170 years, with no one to hear. A pigeon somewhere on the parapet shifts on a small ledge and tucks its head back under its wing. The chimera nearest to it does not move. The pigeon does not move. The wind moves. The note holds. Another minute of Parisian night passes in the careful indifference of stone. How exactly it had risen. How, in the centuries before cranes or steel or modern machines, a building this tall and this strange had ever been built at all, is the next quiet wonder. Picture it now for a moment before sleep. Picture the cathedral as a single, complete shape against the evening sky, and behind that calm surface, very slowly, picture the long work it took to put it there. Imagine standing in front of Notre-Dame in the early summer of 1163. The cathedral is not there yet. The square in front of where it will rise is muddy, narrow, crowded with workshops and small wooden houses. The Ile de la Cité, the small island in the Seine on which the cathedral will eventually sit, is a busy, low place, a market, a court, a tangle of streets, a fishing pier or two. In the middle of it, on a piece of ground cleared for the purpose, a man in heavy robes lays down a single stone. The bishop's name is Maurice de Sully. He is laying the foundation stone of a building that will not be finished in his lifetime, or in his successors, or in his successors' successors. He probably knows this. The great cathedrals of the age, Sens, Leon, Chartres, were all begun in the same century by men who would not live to see them done. To begin a cathedral in the 12th century was to begin something for grandchildren. The work would last in one form or another for nearly 2 centuries. By around 1260, the cathedral was substantially complete, meaning the walls were up, the roof was on, most of the windows were in place, and the basic outline that visitors today would recognize was there, but the small finishing, chapels added along the sides, towers refined, smaller windows pierced into the walls, continued well into the middle of the 1300s, almost 200 years after the bishop laid his stone. It is worth holding that span for a moment. Nearly every stonecutter who began the work, who hauled the first foundation stones into place, who shaped the first columns, who set the first row of arches, never saw what we now see. The cathedral was built by people who would only ever live with a half-finished version of it. The roof was raised by carpenters whose grandfathers had laid the first paving stones. The towers were finished by masons whose great-grandfathers had first arrived on the building site when the cathedral was still drawing. This is not a sentimental fact. It is a structural one. Buildings like Notre-Dame were not designed in the way modern buildings are designed, as a single set of drawings agreed on by one architect, executed in one continuous phase. They were designed in pieces by many people over time. Plans changed. Walls were raised, found to be too thin and braced. Vaults were lifted, found to be too heavy and lightened. The cathedral grew the way a forest grows, by accretion, by accident, by patient correction. The most famous of those corrections is now the most famous feature of the building. Picture the outside of Notre-Dame from the side. From the river looking across, the cathedral has a particular silhouette, a long, tall, ridged shape with what look like a fan of stone arms reaching out from the upper walls down to a row of squat piers below. Those stone arms are called flying buttresses. They are part of what makes a Gothic cathedral feel Gothic. They are the visual fingerprint of the style. They were almost certainly not in the original plan. The flying buttress, as a piece of engineering, was new at the time the cathedral began. Earlier large churches had used heavy walls to support their high roofs, thick stone, almost no windows, an inside that felt like a cave. The new Gothic style wanted the opposite: thin walls, tall windows, an interior full of light. The first builders of Notre-Dame seem to have aimed for that lighter, thinner wall, and the walls, when they rose, did what very tall, thin walls tend to do. They began to crack. A crack in a cathedral wall is not on its own a disaster, but it is a warning. The upper sections of the cathedral, particularly around the choir and the nave, were leaning outward under the weight of the high vault above them. Something needed to push back. Sometime around 1180, historians still argue over the exact decade, the master masons added the buttresses. A flying buttress is a simple thing in idea, a stone arch that leans against the upper wall on one end and onto a heavy stone pier on the other, transferring the outward push of the vault down to the ground. In practice, building one is delicate. The angle must be right. The pier must be heavy enough to take the load. The arch must not lean too hard or it pushes the wall back the other way. The masons added 28 flying buttresses around the apse and the choir alone, with another set around the transepts. From the outside, they look like patient stone arms. From the inside, they are invisible. The walls they support, above the nave, rise to about 33 meters, roughly the height of an 11-story building today. In the 12th century, that was almost the limit of what stone plus geometry could hold up. It is one of the small ironies of the cathedral. Notre Dame's most recognizable silhouette feature, the flying buttress, photographed from 1,000 angles, exists because the original walls were not strong enough. The most famous part of the building was, in a sense, the fix. Now imagine the building site itself. Picture it on a quiet morning, mid-construction, in roughly 1200. The walls are up to perhaps 2/3 of their final height. Wooden scaffolding wraps the entire exterior. Inside, the floor is dust and broken stone. Outside, oxen wait in the muddy square below, harnessed to small carts of fresh stone from the quarries. There is no mechanical power. There are no engines. There is no electricity, no steam, no internal combustion, nothing. Every stone that has risen on a rope. The rope runs through a pulley at the top of the scaffolding. The pulley is part of a treadwheel crane. A treadwheel crane is a large wooden wheel, sometimes two of them mounted on the same shaft, set up at the top of the rising wall. Inside the wheel, a man, sometimes two, walks. Their walking turns the wheel turns the shaft winds the rope lifts the stone. It is worth picturing that, slowly, the man, inside a wooden wheel walking, his feet on damp wood, the wheel turning under him, the rope, somewhere on the other side of the shaft, slowly drawing up a stone block twice his weight, the block rising, swinging less, finally arriving at the top, where two other masons reach out with iron hooks and guide it into place. Treadwheel cranes are slow. A single block could take many minutes to lift to 30 meters. They are also in their way perfectly safe. They cannot suddenly run away, because the only power source is the man walking inside. When he stops, the wheel stops. Many of the medieval cathedrals of Europe, including Notre-Dame, were built with cranes of this kind. Some of them somewhere, may have been left in place after a cathedral was finished, the wheel quietly rotting in the rafters for centuries. The wheel turns, the stone rises, another stone arrives in the square below, another mason picks up his chisel. Somewhere on the surfaces of the stones, the masons leave their own quiet record, small marks scratched into the surface of a block, a triangle, a star, a crossed line, a small flower, were used by individual stone cutters to identify their work. The marks were a form of accounting. The cathedral was a great employer, and stone cutters were paid by the piece. Each one needed to know which blocks were his. The marks were small, often half hidden, often placed on a face of the stone that would face inward and never be seen again. But on the cathedral walls, somewhere, in cracks and corners, those small private marks still survive, untouched for centuries, in the handwriting of medieval workers whose full names we will never know. So the cathedral rose, stone by stone, wheel turn by wheel turn, mason by mason, the forest above slowly being made ready in its swamp would not arrive for another generation. The flying buttresses were still being designed day by day in response to the cracks they found. The walls were finding their balance, and so as the dust settled and the wheels turned and the years passed, the cathedral that the bishop had begun on a muddy island became, slowly, the cathedral we know. Picture, while we are here, the journey of a single stone block from quarry to cathedral. The stone for Notre-Dame came from quarries in the Ile-de-France, the soft limestone of the Paris basin. Most of it came from a few specific quarries, Saint-Leu-de-Sérène north of the city, and several smaller sites closer to home. The limestone was not particularly hard. That was both its virtue and its weakness. Soft stone could be cut and shaped quickly by a skilled mason. Soft stone also weathered over centuries into the slightly rounded edges that the cathedral wears today. A block, when it left the quarry, would be roughly square, slightly larger than its finished size. It traveled on a wooden ox cart, slowly, along the rough roads of the medieval Ile-de-France, down to the Seine. There it was transferred to a flat-bottomed river barge. The barges, drawn by horses on the towpath, or moved by long poles in the shallow places, brought the stones to a small landing on the Ile de la Cité, very close to the building site. From the landing, oxen and men hauled the blocks the last short distance to the cathedral. There they were laid in piles around the perimeter of the rising walls. A mason called the banker mason would take each block and finish shape it on a low stone bench before it was lifted to its place. The fine carving, the leafy capitals at the tops of columns, the small faces tucked into corners, the slow geometry of an arch, was done at ground level in good light, where a chisel could be moved with precision. The site itself, at the height of construction, must have been louder than people today imagine a medieval place to be. The mallet on the chisel, the saw in the saw pit, the shout of one mason to another, the lowing of oxen waiting at the cart line, the slow creaking of the treadwheel cranes overhead, the slap of barge ropes against wooden landings down by the river. The cathedral, while it was rising, was an industrial place, a small factory of stone and rope surrounded by a small city of workshops, food sellers, water carriers, and the wooden lodges where the masons kept their tools at night. In one of those wooden lodges, the masons' lodge called the Loge, the master mason kept the great wooden drawings of the cathedral laid out on a long table or scratched directly into the floor in chalk. The drawings were not blueprints in the modern sense. They were patterns for individual pieces, the curve of an arch, the profile of a column. Each mason would copy his piece from the drawing, then carve it. The drawings over a generation of building would slowly be erased and redrawn. At night, the lodge was dark and quiet. The drawings rested on the floor. The tools rested in their wooden boxes. The half-finished blocks rested in piles outside. The treadwheel cranes rested motionless in the cold air. Somewhere overhead, the higher courses of the cathedral were not yet built, and the sky was visible where, in another generation, stone would close it off. The building in those quiet hours was simply a beginning that other people would have to finish. The story does not end here. The wheels eventually stopped. The dust settled. The masons went home. For a long time after, very little happened to building, and then much later, in a single evening in the spring of 2019, something began to happen that no one had planned for at all. When the morning came, on the 16th of April in 2019, three things were still there. The two bell towers were still standing. The light was grey, and the air on the parvis smelled of wet smoke, but the towers were the same shape they had always been. The west facade, where the kings of Judah looked down on the square, was still in place. The walls of the nave, blackened along the upper edges, were still holding the shape of the cathedral they had held for 8 centuries. Inside, almost everyone expected to find total ruin. They did not. The 3 rose windows, the great west rose, the north rose, the south rose, were still in place, not broken, not shattered. The deep blues and reds of the medieval glass had survived the heat. Through the south rose, the morning light came in just as it had the day before, and in the south tower, hung very quietly in the air, was the great bell, the 13-ton bell, the one that had rung for the coronations of kings, and for the funerals of presidents, and for every Easter for centuries, was still there, unmoved, in the dark. That is the morning. The cathedral, the day after, smaller in some ways than it had been, but still itself. Tonight we will speak softly about the evening before it. There is no need to hurry through. The cathedral, in this story, is already saved. The fire began in the roof space, in the early evening of the 15th of April. The first alarm sounded at 20 minutes past 6 in the evening. The cathedral was carefully emptied. Inside, the small hum of conversation that fills any Paris afternoon. Tourists, schoolchildren, families lighting candles, an old man saying a prayer in a side chapel, went quiet. The doors were closed behind them. The square outside slowly filled with people looking up. Above the stone vault, where almost no one ever goes, where, as we have said, the forest had hung for 7.5 centuries, the wood was beginning to burn. Old oak burned slowly at first. The fire was, for the first half hour, very small. A small orange light on the underside of a beam, then a larger one, then another and another, leaping along the line of the ridge. By a little after 7, smoke was rising visibly above the roof. By 7:30, flames. By a little before 8, the spire that had stood above the roof since the 1860s, was on fire. Here is the small fact about that spire that is sometimes lost in the telling. The spire that fell that night was not the medieval one. It was not 1,000 years old. It was not 800 years old. It was, at the time of its fall, about 160 years old. Viollet-le-Duc had raised it during the Great Restoration of the 1850s and 60s, a tall, slender, lead-clad arrow of oak, designed to make the cathedral feel more vertical than the original masons had made it. It was a beautiful spire, and a young one. The medieval cathedral had stood for centuries without it. At 10 minutes to 8 in the evening, the spire began to lean. 2 minutes later, it bent further, and at 50 minutes past 7, the official time, recorded carefully by the people watching, it fell. It fell through the roof of the cathedral, through the great oak forest above the vault, and the burning beams that it tore down with it sent a draught and a rolling fireball through the rest of the attic. The whole story, told that way, is a sequence of small clocks and exact times. It is in another way much simpler. Above the cathedral, the forest burned, the spire went down, and inside the cathedral, the question of the night became, what could be saved? What was saved that night was saved by people. There is no other way to put it. Within minutes of the alarm, a chain of people began to form. Firefighters from the Paris Brigade, the Sapeurs-Pompiers de Paris, were inside the cathedral within the first quarter of an hour. They were joined by police, by clergy, and by members of the cathedral staff. Together, with great care, they began to carry out the relics and the artworks. The most famous of these is what is called the Crown of Thorns, a circular braid of rushes kept in a sealed reliquary that has been venerated as a relic of the crucifixion for centuries. It had been kept at Notre-Dame since the 13th century, when King Louis IX, Saint Louis, brought it from Constantinople. The tunic of Saint Louis, a piece of the king's own clothing, was kept beside it. Both were locked in a safe at the end of the nave. Both were taken out that night by people who walked into a burning building and walked out again. The fire brigade chaplain, a man named Jean-Marc Fournier, a former military chaplain who had served at the Bataclan attacks 4 years earlier, is the figure most often named in the telling. He was reportedly inside the cathedral with a team of firefighters when the safe was opened and the crown was carried out. He is also said to have given a brief blessing inside the burning nave. Whether that detail is exact or has grown a little in the telling, the larger picture is true. A group of people, in the smoke and heat of the evening, formed a chain, and the relics, and many of the smaller treasures of the cathedral, came out one by one. Other works were carried out the same way. Paintings unhooked from the walls of side chapels, reliquaries from glass cases, older statues, small, fragile, irreplaceable, wrapped quickly in cloths and passed from hand to hand toward the parvis, where police vehicles took them away. The work continued past midnight. The fire continued past midnight. The two were not separate operations. They braided into one another outside on the square and on the bridges over the Seine. A kind of silence settled over the city. Parisians often complain about Paris. That night they did not complain. The bars near Notre-Dame went quiet. A small crowd on the Ile Saint-Louis began to sing, very softly, the Ave Maria. Strangers stood next to strangers and watched the sky above the cathedral turn the color of old copper. By 2 in the morning, the fire was under control. By 6, it was out. The roof was gone. The spire was on the floor of the nave, a long shape of broken oak and crumpled lead. The forest above was ash. The bell towers were standing. The rose windows were intact. The crown was at the town hall, then later moved to the Louvre. The tunic was with it. The cathedral was not destroyed. It was, very precisely, not destroyed. In the 5 years that followed, the work of repair was patient. The new forest was assembled. The spire was rebuilt to Viollet-le-Duc's design. The interior was cleaned. Many of the smaller works that had been carried out that night were returned, one by one, to their places. In December of 2024, the cathedral reopened to the public. In the days after the fire, the cathedral was full of people again, but different people. The tourists were not allowed in. The doors were closed. Instead, the building filled with conservators in white coveralls, with architectural engineers carrying clipboards, with stonemasons climbing carefully along the high galleries to assess the damage block by block. They moved slowly. There was no rush. The cathedral was, for a long time after the fire, considered an extremely delicate patient. Lead from the melted roof had fallen everywhere in the form of fine dust, coating the stone and the marble floor in a thin grey film. The dust was poisonous. Anyone entering the cathedral for the next several months did so in a sealed suit with a respirator and was carefully washed clean before leaving. The work, even in the early stages, was as careful as surgery. The roof above was, for a long time, just sky, a temporary canvas tarp raised on a forest of scaffolding was the only thing keeping rain out of the upper interior. When it rained, drops sometimes still reached the floor below, and small puddles formed on the worn paving where, just weeks earlier, families had walked. Outside, on the parvis, a quiet temporary office had been set up. Donations were arriving from around the world. Within 48 hours of the fire, hundreds of millions of euros had been promised from individual donors, from corporations, from small parishes, from people sending 5 euros or 10 euros from countries where they had never been to Paris. The cathedral, in the days after the fire, was no longer just a Parisian building. It was a thing that strangers on every continent had decided to help save. In workshops elsewhere in France, the work began on the new spire. Architects went back to Viollet-le-Duc's 19th century drawings, the same drawings that had once been used to argue with him over what a medieval cathedral should look like, and chose to follow them exactly. The new spire would be the old new spire, raised again in the same shape it had taken in 1860. In forests across the country, foresters began the careful work, already described, of selecting the 1,300 oaks of the new forest. In small bell foundries elsewhere, casters checked the design of Emmanuel and confirmed that he had not been damaged. In studios across Paris, restorers laid out the great paintings and statues that had been carried out that night, one by one, on long tables, and began the slow work of cleaning the soot from their surfaces. The city around the cathedral grew used to the changed silhouette. From the bridges over the Seine, you could see for years the great construction crane that loomed above the building, a yellow-painted steel arm taller than the towers themselves. From the Ile Saint-Louis, in the evenings you could hear the soft hum of the work, going on slowly in the dark, and then gradually the silhouette changed back. The crane came down. The new spire rose into the place where the old one had been. The forest was assembled, beam by beam, in the great workshops where it had been pre-cut, and lifted piece by piece onto the cathedral. The lead was replaced. The interior was cleaned. By the autumn of 2024, the cathedral was finished again. In December, the doors opened. The cathedral was, in those long months and years, the work of more people than anyone could count. Architects, masons, carpenters, glaziers, foundry workers, restorers, conservators, fire experts, art historians, lead specialists, oak foresters, bell founders, and many quieter trades besides. Everyone had a piece. No one had the whole. The cathedral, in its repair as in its building, was simply too large for any one person to hold. It had to be carried gently by many sets of hands. There is, if you want it, a small lesson somewhere in that night. The cathedral had survived for 8 centuries because in every one of them, when something went wrong, someone had walked into it and pulled out what mattered. That is, in the long view, what cathedrals are. They are buildings that are inhabited. They are saved again and again by hands. In the South Tower, all that night, the bell hung silent in the dark. It was too heavy to fall. It was too heavy to move. The bell's own story is the next one we will follow. Picture the inside of a bell tower at night. Stone walls the color of cold ash, a wooden floor worn smooth in places by hundreds of years of feet, a wooden ladder leading further up, a single small window, narrow, looking out over the rooftops of Paris. The air smells faintly of dust and pigeon, and very faintly of old metal. In the middle of the tower hangs a bell. The bell is so large that if you were a small child, you could walk under it and not touch the rim. It is the size of a small room. Its rim is wider than a tall man's outstretched arms. Its surface is dark bronze, almost black in some places, faintly green in others, marked in long letters around the top with a name and a date. The name is Emmanuel. The date is 1681. Emmanuel is the great bell of Notre-Dame. He hangs in the South Tower, where he is hung, with one short interruption, for over 3 centuries. He weighs about 13 tons, about as much as 2 African elephants. His clapper, the iron tongue that strikes him from inside, weighs about 500 kilograms on its own. His diameter at the rim is 2 meters and 62 centimeters. He rings, when he rings, in F sharp. There has been an Emmanuel, a bell called Emmanuel, in this tower for longer than most of the streets around the cathedral have existed. The first version of him was cast in the 15th century. By the late 1600s, that earlier bell had cracked, and Louis XIV, the king who built Versailles, the king of the sun, ordered him recast. The recasting was done in 1681 in a foundry in the city, and the new bell was brought across the river and lifted with ropes and many men into the South Tower. Bells, when they are made, are given names. The medieval and early modern tradition is that a bell, like a ship, has a name and a story of its own. Many great bells of Europe have names that visitors no longer know. Emmanuel is one of the few whose name is still spoken. He was not always alone. For most of his existence, the towers of Notre-Dame held many bells, some larger, some smaller, each with its own pitch, its own purpose, its own name. There were bells named Marie and Gabriel and Guillaume and Pasquier and Thibaut and Jean and Claude and Nicholas and Françoise. Each had been cast at a different time by a different bell founder for a different reason. They rang together for great holy days. They rang separately for smaller things, for funerals, for prayer hours, for warnings. Imagine the city below them on a great day, the bells of Notre-Dame ringing in layers, each at its own pitch, the F sharp of Emmanuel underneath, the higher pitches of the smaller bells above. The sound rolls across the river, across the mare, across the small streets toward the Latin Quarter. Pigeons rise, conversations pause. The sound, even in the open air, is felt as much as heard. Now picture the same city in 1791. The revolution is 2 years old. The king is still alive, but unsteady. The church is unsteady. The cathedral, for the moment, is a sort of public building belonging to the nation. There is a war on, or one is coming, and the new government needs metal. Bronze is one of the metals it needs. Bronze melted down makes cannon. Bronze melted down also makes coin. Between May of 1791 and August of 1792, the towers of Notre-Dame went silent, one bell at a time. The revolutionary government sent workmen up into the towers. The bells were detached from their wooden frames. They were lowered slowly on ropes, exactly as they had been raised, but in reverse, to the floor of the nave below. They were broken there into manageable pieces. The pieces were carried out into the square, loaded onto carts, and taken to foundries across France. Marie went, Gabriel went, Guillaume went, Pasquier went, Thibaut went, Jean went, Claude went, Nicholas went, Françoise went. In every case the same thing happened. A bell that had hung in a tower for 100 years, or 200 or 3, was lowered down. A bell that had a name was broken into nameless metal. The metal was melted, poured into molds, and cooled. Some of it became coins, with revolutionary heads on them. Some of it became cannon, which were dragged out to the borders of the new republic. Each of the 9 bells became 100 small things scattered across the country. Emmanuel did not go. The reason, as best the records suggest, was simple. He was too heavy. To remove a 13-ton bell from a high stone tower takes a great deal of careful work. It takes scaffolding inside the tower. It takes rope of unusual strength. It takes time. The revolutionary workman who came to the tower may have looked at him, looked at the height of the tower, looked at the time it would take to bring him down, and decided to start with the easier bells first. By the time they had worked their way through the others, the war had shifted, or the political mood had shifted, or someone had quietly decided that this particular bell was worth keeping. The records on that last point are thin. What is certain is that Emmanuel was still in the tower alone when the revolution ended. For about a decade, the South Tower held him in silence. The other tower held only emptiness. The cathedral below was used for many things: a temple of reason for a time, a storehouse, a wine depot at one strange point, and the bells did not ring. In 1802, by order of Napoleon, the new emperor of the French, Emmanuel, was returned to active use. He was lowered briefly to be inspected, then lifted back into his frame, retuned and rung. The city, hearing him for the first time in years, paused. The other bells came back, slowly, much later. Most of the bells that ring in Notre-Dame today are quite young. Many were cast in 2013 for the cathedral's 850th anniversary and given names that echo the lost medieval bells: Marie, Gabriel, Anne-Geneviève, Denis, Marcel, Etienne, Benoit Joseph, Maurice, and Jean-Marie. They are bronze, like Emmanuel, but they are new bronze. The lost bells are not back. The metal is somewhere still, in the form of coins long out of circulation, or pieces of cannon long since melted into something else. But the great bell, the F-sharp bell, has been there nearly the whole time. Imagine standing below him tonight, the wooden floor of the tower under your feet. The long rope, when it is in use, falls past you toward the wheel that turns the bell. When the ringer pulls, slowly the bell does not yet move. It takes several pulls, slow, steady, increasing, to start a 13-ton bronze body swinging. The first sound is small, the second is a little larger. By the third or fourth swing, the clapper strikes, and the tower itself trembles very faintly with the note F sharp, slow, deep, traveling out over the city, and then, between rings, the tower goes quiet again. The bell hangs, the wood creaks, the rope is still. The window shows the same small piece of Paris sky. Tonight he is not ringing. Tonight he is hanging in the dark, as he has hung most of his life. The clapper rests gently against the inside of the rim. The bronze cools. The tower waits. There is a particular memory people in Paris carry of Emmanuel. It is, for older people, the memory of a Sunday morning. The narrow streets around the Ile de la Cité are quiet, with that particular Sunday quiet that European cities still sometimes manage in their oldest parts. The cafes are not yet open. The pigeons have the parvis nearly to themselves. The light is the color of pale tea. And then, somewhere above the rooftops, very far up in the South Tower, Emmanuel begins. The first stroke does not announce itself. It is a soft, deep note that almost seems to come from underneath your feet rather than from above. The second stroke is a little louder. By the third or fourth, the sound has filled the small streets. People at the windows of nearby apartments, those who have lived there long enough not to think about it, feel the glass tremble very faintly in the frames. People in the street look up. The pigeons rise. The note hangs over the city for a long time after each strike. F sharp, slow, slightly fading at the edges. It travels along the river. It reaches the Marais. It reaches, very faintly, the Latin Quarter. People going home from a long night, walking across the bridges, hear it and slow down, even if only for a moment. It is the kind of sound that asks for a moment. Then the smaller bells join in their higher tones, and the morning becomes a brief small cathedral of layered sound, the great low note underneath, the brighter notes above it, the way a forest has tall trees and lower undergrowth. The sound carries for a minute, 2 minutes, 3, and then, one by one, the bells go quiet, beginning with the smallest. Emmanuel is the last to fall silent. His final stroke is the deepest. The last note holds for almost a minute after the clapper stops moving, drifting through the streets like a wide, slow last breath. Then the morning goes back to its Sunday quiet. This happens on average only a few times a year. Emmanuel is not rung every Sunday. He is reserved for the great occasions, Easter, Christmas, the great feast days, certain national moments. Most weeks, the South Tower is silent. The smaller bells handle the ordinary work of the cathedral hours. Emmanuel rests. When he was rung after the cathedral reopened in December of 2024, the city paused in much the same way it had paused 2 centuries earlier, when Napoleon's craftsman returned him to his frame and rang him again for the first time after the revolution. Strangers stood next to strangers on the parvis. People who do not pray closed their eyes. The note rolled out over the river. The cathedral, in that moment, was very simply itself again. There is in a great bell of this kind, a kind of memory. The bronze has rung through nearly every important event of the cathedral's life since the late 17th century. He has rung for state funerals and for great national moments. He rang for Napoleon. He rang for the liberation of Paris in 1944. He rang for the 850th anniversary of the cathedral in 2013. He has been the deep voice of a city through wars and crownings and quieter days, and he is hanging tonight, still, in the South Tower, waiting for the next thing he is asked to mark. Tonight, of course, none of that. Tonight he simply hangs. The dust of the South Tower settles on his shoulders, very slowly, as it has settled on bronze and on stone for centuries. The 13 tons do not stir. The 500 kilograms of the clapper do not stir. The F sharp is folded up inside the body, the way a song is folded up inside a closed instrument, and the body is at rest. Whatever the morning has waiting for him, silence, or one stroke, or many, he will be ready when it is time. Long after the bells fall silent, The light from the rose windows below continues, just barely, to drift across the empty floor of the nave. That too is a story of survival, and the next quiet thing to follow. There is a kind of blue that you cannot quite describe. It is not the blue of the sky on a clear day. It is not the blue of the sea. It is not the blue of cornflowers, or of a robin's egg, or of a small lake at dawn. It is a deeper, slower blue, a blue that seems to absorb the eye rather than reflect it. When you stand under it in the right light, you stop talking. You forget to look at the people around you. You look up, and for a long, quiet moment, you look only at blue. That blue lives mostly in 3 windows. The 3 great rose windows of Notre-Dame, the west rose, the north rose, the south rose, are circles of stained glass set high in the cathedral walls. They were not built at the same time. The west rose, set above the main entrance, dates to about 1225, fairly early in the cathedral's life. The north rose, set in the transept on the cold side of the building, dates to about 1250. The south rose opposite it on the warmer side dates to about 1260, but was heavily restored in the 19th century. Each is a wheel of small panels arranged around a central pane, each panel telling its own small story. Of the 3, the north rose is the one that has changed least. Most of its glass is still the glass that was placed there around 1250. That means tonight, when light comes through the north rose, it is passing through pieces of colored glass that are over 770 years old. The hands that cut those panels were the hands of glaziers who lived in the city in the time of King Louis IX. They are gone for so long that even their names are gone. Their glass is still here. The north rose is also the bluest of the 3. The deep blue in the panels was made by mixing cobalt into molten glass. A little copper, a little iron was sometimes added too. The cobalt itself came from ores mined in Central Europe and brought over long distances to the glassworks of medieval France. When the cobalt-rich glass was poured and cooled and cut, it carried in every small piece a blue that the modern eye still recognizes at once. The eye recognizes it the way the ear recognizes an old voice. The exact recipe, what proportion of cobalt, what proportion of other metals, what temperatures, what additions, what particular sands, was not, so far as we know, written down. The medieval glaziers worked from craft, from memory, from apprenticeship. They did not publish manuals. When they died, the precise details of how they had made their color died with them, slowly, generation by generation. We have not lost the color entirely. Modern glaziers, restoring panels in cathedrals across Europe, can make blue glass that is very close to the medieval blue. They can match the look of the old panels well enough that from below you cannot tell, but when the new panels are placed beside the old ones and the light comes through, restorers say that the old glass has a kind of inner depth that the new glass lacks. The new glass is blue. The old glass is blue and something else. The something else is what we cannot quite name. Some of this is no doubt romance. Old glass is uneven. Its surface has tiny bubbles, small ridges, occasional impurities, and the light passing through scatters in a way that makes the color feel three-dimensional. Modern glass is smoother, and the color as a result lies flatter. The mystery of the medieval blue is also partly the mystery of imperfection, but the point is gentle. There is a blue in the north rose of Notre-Dame that has been there for over 7.5 centuries, and that we cannot quite reproduce. We can stand under it, we can photograph it, we cannot make it again exactly. Picture now the inside of the cathedral on an empty afternoon in winter. The doors are closed, the visitors have not come yet. The floor is cold under bare stone, the pillars rise into the half-dark above. The air smells of old candle wax and faint incense, and of the slightly cold stone of an empty building. On the north side, very high up, the rose window is catching the light from outside. In winter, in Paris, the light from the north is soft. It is not the high direct sun of a summer afternoon. It is a slow diffused light, the color of cold cloud. When that light passes through the north rose, it loses some of its whiteness and picks up the color of the panels. By the time it reaches the floor of the nave far below, it has become, very specifically, that medieval blue. The blue lies on the floor in patches. The patches move slowly as the sun moves outside. Across an afternoon, you can watch the patches drift, one stone at a time, across the cold paving of the cathedral. They drift the way a slow cloud drifts. By evening they have moved from one side of the nave to the other. By dusk they are very faint. By night they are gone. This is the small piece of the cathedral that does not photograph well. A photograph catches the panels. It does not catch the way the light moves on the floor. To know that light, you have to stand inside the building for an hour in winter without speaking, and let the color drift past your feet. The other roses contribute their own quieter colors. The west rose above the main entrance is mainly red, a deep soft red, threaded with greens and yellows, that warms the back of the cathedral on summer evenings when the setting sun comes straight through it. The south rose carries warmer tones, oranges and pale yellows, restored in the 19th century but holding the same general feeling. The three roses together, when the cathedral is full of late afternoon light, are not three separate colors. They are a slow conversation in light across the building. Now imagine very gently the people who first stood under these windows. 12th century Parisians, 13th century pilgrims, 14th century travelers from the countryside who had never seen colored glass before. For most of them, the experience of standing under the north rose for the first time must have been almost too much for words. The world they came from was mostly brown and gray, the brown of mud streets, the gray of stone walls, the green of fields, the dark wood of small houses. Bright color was rare. Colored cloth was expensive. Painted images in churches were the closest most people came to seeing color used deliberately. And then they walked into a cathedral, and the floor had blue on it, blue that came from nowhere they could trace, blue that moved very slowly across the stone, blue that, for one quiet afternoon, made the world feel as if a piece of heaven had leaked through the wall. Most of those people are gone. The window is still there. The blue is still there. In the great fire of 2019, when the roof above this nave was burning and the great oak forest was collapsing, the 3 rose windows held, the west rose held, the north rose held, the south rose held. The heat was, in places, severe enough that experts later worried whether the lid between the panels would have softened. It had softened a little in places. The panels had moved very faintly in their frames, but the glass itself, the 770-year-old glass, did not break. In the morning, the blue was still there. Some things in this cathedral have been replaced. The forest was replaced. The spire was replaced. The bells, except for one, were replaced. But the blue in the north rose of all things in the building is the same blue that 13th century glaziers chose in a workshop somewhere in the city more than 7.5 centuries ago. They poured it hot into molds. They cut it when it was cool with hot irons and small hammers. They set it panel by panel into the lead. They went home one evening in 1250 or 1251, and they did not come back because they were people, and people do not come back. The blue stays. Look closely at any of the rose windows and you find, surprisingly, a kind of guest list. Medieval stained glass was not free. Each panel of the cathedral's windows had to be paid for, and the payment came, in most cases, from a guild, from the bakers, the carpenters, the stonemasons, the wine merchants, the cloth dyers, the small organized trades of medieval Paris. Each guild would commission a particular panel, and at the bottom of that panel, very small, would often appear a tiny image of the guild's craft, a baker pulling bread from an oven, a cooper hammering a barrel, a weaver bent over a small loom. These small donor images are, in their way, the medieval equivalent of a thank you card. They are signatures. They say in colored glass, "This panel of heaven was paid for by us." And they are still, 7.5 centuries later, the closest we come to a portrait of the ordinary working people who built the cathedral. The theological figures up above, the apostles, the saints, the prophets, the scenes from Scripture, are the official subjects of the windows. The donor images tucked into the corners are unofficial. They are the small lower margin where craftspeople, who were not normally allowed into the major spaces of public art, slipped in. A medieval baker, looking up into the rose window his guild had paid for, would see very small a figure with a loaf, and know that figure was him. Most visitors today do not see these small images. The windows are far above the floor. The small figures are small. You need binoculars, or patience, or a guide who knows where to look. But if you stand for a long time at the right place in the cathedral, on the right kind of afternoon, you can pick them out. A small carpenter, a small weaver, a small barrel maker, all very still, all set in colored glass, all looking out over a nave they helped pay for. 800 years later, the people who walked the streets of medieval Paris are mostly lost to history. We do not know their names. We do not know what they looked like. We do not know what they sounded like. But here, in small panels of red and blue and gold, the work of their hands is still recognized, and the shape of their bodies, small bent backs, small careful hands, small tools, is still visible. The cathedral, for them, was a place where their work was made permanent. They built it. The windows said so. This is a small grace of medieval architecture, that the people who paid for it in small contributions over generations were allowed to leave themselves in it in glass. Many panels have lost their color over the centuries. Many have been replaced, but in the north rows where the original glass still mostly stands, those small donor figures are still there in the cobalt and the red, working their small unending work in colored light. And so as the colors on the floor begin to fade with the day, the cathedral settles into evening, and the long quiet of 2 human lifetimes that once happened inside its walls. By the late 1790s, the cathedral was not in good shape. Long before the fire of 2019, long before the restoration of the 1860s, long before even the small comforts of regular candlelight, Notre-Dame had a quieter, slower trouble. It was old, it was tired, it was, in many places, broken. The revolution had been hard on it. In the years between 1790 and 1795, crowds had pulled the statues of the kings of Judah from the west facade, mistaking them for kings of France. The bells, as we have seen, were taken down and melted, except for Emmanuel. The lead in some of the roofs had been stripped, in places for ammunition. The interior had been used for a while as a temple of reason, with banners and inscriptions painted directly over the older paintwork. Later it had been used as a warehouse. Later still, briefly, as a store for wine. By the time the new century began, the cathedral on the small island was structurally sound, but visibly weary. The stone was darkened with smoke and pigeon. The interior walls were patchy with old paint and newer plaster. The windows still let in light, but several panels were broken, and the lead between them in places was sagging. This is the cathedral that Napoleon walked into in candlelight on the 2nd of December of 1804. He had decided several months earlier that he wished to be crowned Emperor of the French in Notre-Dame. The ceremony was to be the largest in living memory. The Pope, Pius VII, would travel from Rome to preside. Josephine, Napoleon's wife, would be crowned beside him. More than 10,000 guests would attend. The choir of the cathedral would sing. The doors of the cathedral on the day would be opened for the first time in years for something other than a small mass. There was, however, the problem of the building. You cannot easily crown an emperor inside a stained, patched, half-broken room. You also cannot, in a few months, rebuild a Gothic cathedral. So what was done instead was a kind of theatre. The artist Charles Percier, with his partner Pierre Fontaine, was asked to dress the cathedral for the day. They built around the entrance a temporary porch made of wood painted to look like stone, with painted columns and painted statues. Inside they hung silk drapery from the upper galleries in long folds that hid the worst of the stone. They built false pillars of plaster and stucco, painted in soft, warm colors that stood in front of the real ones. They whitewashed walls where they could. They placed thousands of candles in iron stands in long lines down the nave, so that on the day itself the light inside the cathedral would be even and warm, and would not show the cracks. It was a stage set, a beautiful one. From any distance, that day the cathedral would have looked nearly perfect. Up close you would have seen the wood behind the painted columns and the canvas behind the painted statues. From every angle a guest might naturally look, the cathedral was magnificent. From every angle a guest would not look, the cathedral was being held together with cardboard. Picture the inside on the morning of the 2nd of December. The air is cold. Outside, snow is on the ground in places. Inside, the candles have been lit for some hours. The smell of the cathedral that day is not the smell of old stone and incense. That smell is buried under the smell of fresh paint and warm wax and pressed velvet. The choir is taking its places in the small gallery beside the altar. The orchestra is tuning. Soldiers in formal coats line the aisles. Josephine is somewhere behind the great west doors, waiting. By midday Napoleon enters. He is small. He is not by any measure tall. The famous portrait we know was painted later by David, and it is taller than he was. But the way the porch and the columns and the silk have been arranged means that he does not look small as he walks down the aisle. The hall, from his eye level, opens out around him like a corridor of warm cloth. The Pope is waiting. The crown is on a cushion. The choir begins to sing, and then, in a moment that has been told 1,000 ways in 1,000 histories, Napoleon does not let the Pope crown him. He takes the crown in his own hands, lifts it above his own head, and sets it there himself. Then he turns and crowns Josephine, who is kneeling on a small stool below him. The Pope, watching, does what popes have to do at moments like this. He says nothing. He blesses what he is asked to bless. The candles burn down. The choir continues. By late afternoon, the ceremony is finished, and the long procession begins to leave the cathedral. The cardboard pillars are still in place. The painted statues are still hanging on their wooden frames. The silk is still pinned to the upper galleries. From outside, on the parvis, the building looks immense. Inside, behind the curtains, the older walls are still tired. 2 days later, the temporary porch will be taken down. The silk will be folded and stored. The candles will be doused. The cathedral, with its 10,000 guests gone, will return to being what it was the week before, a great tired stone building on a small island in the Seine. Almost 3 decades pass. By 1830, the cathedral is in worse shape. The July Revolution has come and gone. Riots have broken windows in places. There is talk in some Parisian newspapers that the building is unsafe, that it should be reduced in size, that the medieval cathedral on the island is more trouble than it is worth. It is in this mood, in 1831, that a young writer of 29, in a small candlelit room not far from the cathedral, finishes a novel. His name is Victor Hugo. The novel is called Notre-Dame de Paris. We know it in English as The Hunchback of Notre Dame. The novel itself is a love letter, half disguised, to the cathedral. The plot, Esmeralda, Quasimodo, Frollo, is a frame around long, slow, patient descriptions of the building itself. Hugo writes whole chapters about its stones. He writes about the towers as if they were living creatures. He writes about the cathedral as a witness to centuries of small human stories. He writes in part because he is afraid the cathedral will be lost. The book is an immediate and great success. It is read aloud in salons. It is translated into every European language within a few years, and the cathedral, which had been close to demolition in the talk of the city, becomes a national icon almost overnight. People begin to visit it. Painters begin to draw it. By 1844, the king has ordered a full restoration. 2 architects are appointed, Jean-Baptiste Lessus and a younger man named Eugène Viollier-le-Duc. Their work over the next 20 years will give the cathedral the spire that will fall in 2019. It will give the chimeras on the high gallery. It will give the cathedral in many ways the face that the modern world will know. Hugo lived to see most of that work finished. He died in 1885, an old man mourned by the country. By then the cathedral had its new spire, its new chimeras, its restored stonework. The cardboard pillars of Napoleon's coronation were long gone. The bells of the Revolution were still mostly missing, and the medieval forest above the ceiling was still there. By the late 1840s, Lassus and Viollet-le-Duc were the 2 architects with the cathedral in their hands. Lassus was the elder. He had a careful, scholarly temperament. He had spent years studying medieval drawings, copying small details from cathedrals across France, learning the geometric rules behind Gothic ornament. He believed in restoration as an act of recovery, that the architect's job was to find what had once been there and put it back as faithfully as the evidence allowed. Viollet-le-Duc was the younger. He had a more theatrical mind. He believed restoration was not just recovery but completion, that the architect could, in some cases, restore a building to a state it had never quite achieved in its first life, by finishing what the original masons had been trying to do. The 2 were friends, and they argued. The cathedral, in the years they worked together, was a quiet, long conversation between these 2 temperaments. Lassus did not live to see the work finished. He died in 1857, at the age of 50, partway through the restoration. Viollet-le-Duc continued for another decade alone. Many of the more dramatic additions, the chimeras, the new spire, some of the more elaborate stonework, were made in the years after Lassus's death. They reflect in style the more theatrical sensibility of the younger man. If Lassus had lived, the cathedral might look a little different today. We cannot know. What we do know is that by 1864, the great work was substantially done. The spire stood in its new place. The chimeras lined the high gallery. The interior had been cleaned and recolored. The roses had been restored where they were broken. The cathedral, after the long century of decay since the Revolution, looked again like a complete and confident Gothic building, perhaps in some places more confident than it had ever looked before. Hugo, by the 1860s, was an old man living mostly in exile on the island of Guernsey, off the coast of Normandy. He had opposed Napoleon's nephew, who had taken power in 1851 and crowned himself emperor in a copy of his uncle's coronation. Hugo had fled the country in protest. From Guernsey he kept writing poems, novels, essays, and he kept his eye on what was happening in Paris. The slow restoration of Notre-Dame was for him a kind of personal victory. He had written the cathedral into the national imagination. The nation had then chosen to save it. He returned to Paris in 1870 after the fall of Napoleon's nephew. He lived for 15 more years. He visited the cathedral occasionally. He attended state events there. He grew old, white-haired, slightly stooped, walking with a cane along the streets of an island whose stones he had, in some small way, helped to keep where they were. When he died in 1885, his coffin was brought to the Pantheon by way of the Champs-Élysées in a long, slow funeral procession. 2 million people lined the route. The cathedral on the island, behind Hugo's funeral, stood where he had left it, restored, complete, with its new spire pointing up at a sky he could no longer see. Picture the cathedral after Hugo's funeral. The crowds have gone home. The street lamps have come on. The river is quiet. The towers stand against a dark Paris sky. 2 centuries of upheaval, revolution, empire, restoration, republic, revolution again, empire again, republic again, have moved through the city around the building. The building has stood through every one of them, and as the lamps along the parvis dim, the river beside the cathedral keeps moving, and the night above the towers settles into something very quiet. It is late now. The river beside the cathedral keeps moving in the dark, the way it always has. The water is not loud. It moves the way water moves when no one is listening. Across its surface, the lights of the street lamps along the embankment break into long, soft, slow shapes that slide along with the current and disappear under the bridges. The square in front of Notre-Dame has emptied. The last visitor went home some hours ago. The last camera was put away. The pavement of the parvis, cleaned of the day, is dark and quiet. Somewhere on it, almost invisible in the low light, the small bronze star is still there, set into the stone, the small point from which a country is measured. No one is standing on it. No one is taking its picture. It is just there, as it has been since 1924, and as it will be tomorrow. Above the square, the west facade rises into the dark. The kings of Judah are standing in their long row across the front of the cathedral, where they have stood in one form or another for centuries. Some of the heads were lost long ago in the revolution. Some have been replaced. Many have been weathered to the point where the features are almost gone, and only the shape of a body and the shape of a small crown remain. They are looking out at a city they have outlived several times over. Above them, between the 2 towers, the chimeras lean on their gallery. The strige with his chin on his hand, the long-necked bird, the goat with its heavy face. They are not medieval, as we said, but they have stood there now for 170 years, which is long enough for the rain of Paris to soften them, and the wind of Paris to round them, and the smoke of Paris to darken them, and the photographs of Paris to make them famous. They are watching the city tonight the way they watch it every night, which is to say, gently. They are watching it the way old creatures watch a thing they no longer need to understand. Behind them, the great roof of the cathedral runs the long length of the nave. The new lead is still bright in places, where the moon catches it. The lines of the ridge run cleanly toward the spire, the new spire, the rebuilt spire, the spire that was raised again in the years after the fire, in the same shape as the one Viollet-le-Duc had drawn. From the river in the dark, you cannot easily tell that the spire is new. It looks as if it has always been there. Below the lead, hidden inside the stone shell of the cathedral, the new forest rests in the dark. The wood is bright still, where the old wood was dark. It smells of fresh sap, where the old wood smelled of long settled dust. But the shape of the beams is the same. The angle of the trusses is the same. The pegs at the joints are wooden, as they were before, and the pegs have been carved from the same kind of oak. If you were to walk through the New Forest tonight with a small lantern, you would feel exactly what someone walking through the Old Forest used to feel, that you were inside a long, narrow, upside-down ship, and that the ship was very still. The new wood will dry slowly over the coming decades. In a generation it will be darker. In a century it will smell less of sap and more of dust. In 5 centuries the carpenters and architects who have worked on it in our own time will be names in a database or names in a corner of a museum. The wood will still be there. It will still be the forest. Below the forest, the stone vaults curve overhead in long, slow ribs. The blackening of the fire has been cleaned in most places. The interior is again the color of pale stone. The color of warm, pale stone is the most cathedral-like of all colors and the most calming. It is the color of a cathedral when the building has stopped doing anything and is simply resting. On the cold side of the nave, high up, the north rose window is dark tonight. The street lamps outside are not strong enough to push their light through it. The cobalt is sleeping. The 770-year-old glass is sleeping. The blue is there, waiting for the morning. Above the north rose, in the south tower, a 13-ton body of bronze hangs in the dark, perfectly still. The bell is not ringing tonight. The clapper rests gently against the inside of the rim. The bronze has cooled to the temperature of the tower. The wooden floor below the bell is dry. The rope, hanging long down toward the floor, does not move. Around the bell, the small windows of the south tower frame small pieces of the city, a corner of a bridge, a slice of the river, a piece of the dome of the Pantheon glowing far off in the dark. Emmanuel has been ringing for over 3 centuries, and not ringing for over 3 centuries. There is, in a great bell, almost as much quiet as there is sound. The night is the quiet half. Below the south tower, in the side chapels, the small candles have been put out. The wax has cooled. A faint smell of warm wax still lingers near the side altars. The chairs in the nave are arranged in long, patient rows, facing the east end where the high altar is. No one is sitting in them. The cathedral is doing what cathedrals do when they are empty. It is holding its shape. A crown of thorns is in its place, locked in its small reliquary in the treasury, where it returned after the fire. The tunic of St. Louis is in its case. The paintings have been rehung. The reliquaries have been put back, one by one, where they belong. The small chain of hands that carried them out on a particular night in 2019 has long since gone home. Some of those people are still alive. Some of them by now are old. All of them, the chaplain, the firefighters, the police officers, the museum staff, the volunteers, are, on this night, somewhere else, asleep. The deepest hour of the night at the cathedral is not midnight. It is later, somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning, after the last of the late walkers has gone home, and before the first of the early bakers has opened a shop. The city around the cathedral falls into a quiet that almost feels intentional. The lamps glow, the river moves, the cathedral stands, and almost nothing else for a long stretch moves at all. In that hour the air around the towers is cold and still. The chimeras are not even singing. The wind has dropped. The lead of the roof, no longer warmed by the day, has cooled to the temperature of the air. The water in the lead gutters lies flat. Somewhere on the parapet, a single gull might be sleeping with its head tucked under its wing. Inside the cathedral, the side chapel candles have burned low. The wax in each iron stand is the color of old honey, slumped slightly to one side. A faint last thread of smoke rises from one of them and bends, slowly, in the still cold air, and disappears against the dark of the upper vault. Up in the south tower, Emmanuel hangs. The rope below him does not move. The clapper, gently touching the inside of the rim, holds the position it has held for hours. The bronze is the temperature of the stone now. The note he made the last time he rang, F sharp, the deep note, the slow note, is no longer in the air. It has gone all the way out into the city and dissipated and become silence again. There is only the small, heavy presence of a bronze body in a stone room in the dark. Up in the new forest above the vault, the oak smells faintly of resin. The wood has not yet learned, in its new life, how to make the deep, slow creaks that the old wood used to make. It is still settling. It is still discovering, beam by beam, what it means to be a roof. In a few years the creaks will come. The forest will speak. Down on the parvis, the bronze star in the pavement is dark. The lamps along the embankment glow on, but they do not reach it. The star is just there, with no one looking. Tomorrow morning a few tourists will find it again and step on it and take photographs and walk away. Tonight no one is doing any of those things. The star is simply embedded in the stone, the way it has been embedded since 1924, the way it will be embedded for many more years to come. Out on the river, a long boat passes, very slowly, with all its lights low. The pilot in the wheelhouse is alone. He does not look up at the cathedral. He has seen it 1,000 times. He is thinking about coffee. The boat passes under the bridge, and its wake makes small, soft slaps against the stone embankment. And then the river is still again. The cathedral holds. It has been holding all night. It will hold until morning. It has been holding for 850 years, and the next 850 are still ahead of it, And tonight that is too far away to think about. Tonight there is only the dark, and the cold air, and the river, and the stone. The crown of thorns in its treasury holds its small shape. The tunic in its case holds its small shape. The new oak above the vault holds its small shape. The blue in the north rose sleeping holds its small shape. The chimeras hold their small shape. The bell holds its small shape. The kings of Judah with their lost faces hold their small shape. The bronze star in the parvis holds its small shape. The cathedral, made of all those small shapes, holds its larger one. And outside around it, the city does what cities do at this hour, which is to say almost nothing. Very gently, and so very gently, the building settles into the dark. A small wind moves along the upper galleries of the cathedral. The chimeras do not notice. A bird somewhere up near the spire shifts on a small ledge and then goes still again. A leaf moves across the parvis. The bronze star in the pavement is still there. The river still moves below the bridges. The lamps still glow on the embankment. Inside, the small candles in front of the side chapels have been lit, as they are every night for the morning. They are very small. Their light barely reaches the next pillar, but they are there. The forest above is there. The blue in the north rose is there. The bell in the south tower is there. And tonight, for a long, slow while, that is all the cathedral has to do. It does not need to mean anything. It does not need to explain itself. It does not need to be remembered or photographed or restored or argued about. It can simply stand on the small island in the river, the way it has stood for 850 years, and be quiet. That is the cathedral now. That is the quiet between bells. There is nothing more to hold. This is, in the end, just one building, on one small island, in one river, in one city. It is a building made of stone and lead and oak and bronze. It has been a place of coronation and a place of funeral and a place of fire and a place of rebuilding. It has been a temple of reason. It has been a wine warehouse. It has been a backdrop in films. It has been a place where, on quiet weekdays, an old woman lit a candle for her sister. Most of what it has been quietly. Most of what it has held without anyone watching. For every great service it has hosted, there have been 1,000 small mornings when only a few people walked under its vaults. For every coronation, there have been long winters with nothing at all. The cathedral has been famous, certainly, but the cathedral has also been mostly ordinary. A building that opened in the morning and closed at night, and stood and waited and did the same the next day. 850 years of that. It is the kind of long, slow life that the small lives inside it do not always notice. The masons who began it never saw it finished. The carpenters who set the forest above never saw it grow old. The bell founders who poured Emmanuel never saw him survive a revolution. The glaziers who set the blue into the north rose never saw it sit through the firestorm of 2019. Most of the people who shaped the cathedral did not get to know what it would become. They simply did their piece. They went home. They were forgotten. That is how cathedrals get made. It is perhaps also how lives get made. Most of what we do without knowing what it will become. We set a small piece of stone. We pour a small amount of bronze. We cut a small panel of glass. We write a small page of a novel. We carry one night a small relic out of a burning building in a chain of other people doing the same. The thing we set is not yet a cathedral. It will not be a cathedral for 100 years. The thing we carry is not yet safe. It will not be safe until other people, later, take it from our hands. Tonight, on the small island in the Seine, the cathedral stands, made of all of those small pieces, set and reset and set again across centuries. The river moves around it. The lamps along the embankment glow softly. The bronze star in the pavement waits in the dark. The kings of Judah look out, eyeless, faceless, but standing. The chimeras lean on their gallery. The spire, new, but in the old shape, points at the sky. The forest above, freshly grown, smells of green oak. The north rose on the cold side holds its sleeping blue, and in the south tower the great bell hangs, silent in the dark. Now close your eyes, let the breath slow, let the shoulders soften. There is nothing here to hold. The cathedral is standing. You can rest, sleep well.